I usually just tell them like, hey, I'm just sorry. I just don't think it's a good fit right now. Right now, I have guests booked up to the end of the year. I'll reach out to you again if I think it could be a good fit later on. But right now, I just don't see it as a good fit. I love what you're doing. I just don't think it's a good match for the show.
Most hosts never achieve the results they hoped for. They're falling short on listenership and monetization, meaning their message isn't being heard and their show ends up costing them money. This podcast was created to help you grow your listenership and make money while you're at it. Get ready to take notes. Here's your host, Adam Adams.
Hey, it's Adam Adams. And generally, as you may have gotten accustomed to, any even-numbered episode is supposed to be me alone pouring into you and your business. However, I did so many different interviews with so many really, really good people that on this episode today, even though this would typically just be me pouring into your business, me just sharing something short, like 5, 10, 20 minutes, where I poured into you and your podcast and growing your brand and really getting you in front of everybody. I'm going to do that today with an interview. So let's get right into it. Welcome back to another episode of Podcast on Podcasting. And if you are younger and you felt like that would hold you back. And by the way, I've got Sophia Lorena on. She's going to help pour into you and she's going to help support you. She's passionate about helping other 20-something-year-old women find their way and just be able to grow and get out of their own way. She also is both a loan officer as well as a podcaster. So she's interviewed over 130 people, which is freaking cool. We'll definitely talk a little bit about that. And she's 20. So she's been doing this for around a year and interviewed 130 people. And she's fairly young by a lot of people's standards. I would say that there's been, Sophia, a lot of people that come to me and they're like, hey, I really want to have a podcast. I want to start a podcast, but I'm only 21. So I'm not sure like if I should do it or if I just need to wait. And I'm like, wait for what? Anyway, let's dive in. You are the host of the shit show of my 20s podcast. So the shit show of my 20s. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad to be here. I'm so glad to talk to you and have this conversation. And I think that's definitely a limiting belief that I had before I started my podcast is I'm too young. Who's going to listen to a 20-year-old from California talk about her life and her shit show moments. But the thing that I realized is the way to get these conversations and the easiest way to get to kind of go into the minds of the people that you want to get into is by inviting them onto your podcast and getting to ask them any questions you want and getting to introduce them to your audience. So that was really the reason why I wanted to start it, because I wanted to be able to have access to this information and to these people that usually I wouldn't have access to. So that's the reason why I started mine. Also, I was furloughed for about 3 months. And I know if I don't do anything, I drive myself crazy. So I was like, you need to start the podcast right now, because if you don't start it right now, you're never going to start it. So I realized I had that really short window of time, or if I created some momentum during that time, that I would continue with it. But if I didn't start now, I probably was never going to start it.
So you said if you didn't start now, you were never going to start. So is that because of like fear, or is it more to do with like you knew that you might have to go back to work soon and this was like a missed opportunity?
I think it was a combination of both. I know when I have an idea, if I don't do it within a certain amount of time, it doesn't happen. So I know when I have an idea, I have to do it within a week, or else most likely it's not going to happen. So I kind of know myself. So I know idea has to happen within a week. So I kind of know I have that threshold. So I was like, okay, you have this idea. We need to make it happen within a week. How do we make it happen within a week? That was one of the major parts. Another part was I didn't know when I was going to go back to work because it was kind of up in the air. It said it was going to be 4 weeks. It ended up turning into 3 months. So it was kind of like a gray line situation where I never knew when it was going to happen. I just knew hopefully it was going to happen, but also wasn't for sure that was going to happen either. So it was kind of like, I may go back in 4 weeks. I may go back. I may not. I may lose this job forever. So I just realized that. And then I realized it would be a missed opportunity for me if I didn't do something in this period of time. So it was all those three things together that I was like, this needs to happen like right now.
Wow. Okay. And why did you like decide to call it shit show of my 20s. Like, I can imagine if I was thinking about naming my podcast that, I would have a fear that I'd be like, well, what if people are going to judge me, or what if nobody's going to listen? So I just want to go into your experience as you're naming your podcast.
Yeah. So the reason why I did that name is because I didn't have a personal brand. I didn't have like an audience or anything like that. So I realized that I would have to pick something kind of bold and that kind of stood out once you saw it. And I realized picking a name like that would definitely stand out when you saw it. Another thing about it was I wanted something that sparked resonance. I wanted something that sparked laughter. I wanted something that really caught your eye, and that when you saw it, you would want to be like, what is this? Like, I need to know more about this. Another thing is I wanted something really relatable, and I felt like that was really relatable for the audience I was trying to go for. And so that's why I went for it. And I figured that I actually went pretty well by picking that name. And the reason why I think it's gone so well is because I have it all over my LinkedIn. I have it all over my Instagram. And whenever I like someone's photo, they look at my profile right away. It captures their attention right away. And I think if I would have picked a more vanilla name, it wouldn't have worked the same.
Very, very cool. I like that. All the tips that you mentioned are really good. One of them is that you need to be relatable to your audience. One of them is that you need to stand out. One of them is that you need to surprise people and hook people. Yeah. And so, like, when you put it all together, it becomes a name that seems like it'll really, really work for you. Now, when did your very first episode come out?
So my very first episode, I believe it was April 4th, 2020.
Okay, April 6th. Okay. So it's been a little over a year. How have you done 130 episodes already?
Well, during that period of like about 3 months, I wasn't doing anything. During that period, I interviewed about 70 to 80 people. So that was the majority of it. And then after that, I started interviewing people on weekends. I would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I would interview them before work. So I always figured out a way of how I can interview them. And I just had that goal of hitting at least 100. I wanted to hit 100 within the first year. And I ended up hitting more than that, but it just kind of happened. I didn't really think at the beginning I was going to interview that many people, but I just kind of created momentum. And then I was like, oh, wow, like it's been quite a bit of people since the beginning.
Several questions. So you mentioned that you took weekends to record. You even would wake up at 3 a.m. to record. I don't know very many people who would do that, wake up at 3 a.m. And I think that it's even more when you're 20 years old to want to wake up at 3 a.m. So like there's all of these thoughts going through my mind. I want to really ask, like, well, I guess, was it easy to do that for you? Was it easy to wake up that early? Or because I feel like it would have been a challenge.
Well, I've always been used to waking up early, so it really wasn't a challenge for me. But the thing is I realized I only have this amount of time because I have a full-time job. So I only have this amount of time. I know if I try to record after my job, I'm going to be more tired. So I know it has to happen in the morning or in the weekends when I have more time. So I realized that. So I was like, I don't want to record when I'm tired. I know if I record at the beginning of the day, it's going to be a lot better. So might as well just wake up early and find a way to make it work.
Well, who were your guests? Like, were you having your guests have to wake up at 3 a.m. as well?
No. So I was working out, getting ready, and then recording. I was recording at about 5 to 6 a.m. California time. And then my guests, they were from the UK or they're from the East Coast, or they weren't usually from California because no one else wanted to wake up at the same time that I was. But it was usually a later time whatever time zone they were at. But
okay. Yeah. And with these 100 plus guests that you got in the first few months or the first year, with you finding those guests, like, was it scary? Was there limiting beliefs on if they would even say yes? How did you approach it? Like, were you looking on LinkedIn? Were you looking on Instagram? Like, did you use some service? Give us your experience on finding your first 100 guests.
Yeah, so I used a bit of everything. So I used Podmatch, I used podcastguest.com, I use Facebook groups for finding podcast guests, I use matchmaker.fm, I use Audrey, And I also use LinkedIn. I also go through hashtags on Instagram. So I go through hashtag women in business, hashtag podcasters of Instagram, hashtag boss babe. And then I look at different accounts like Boss Babe, and I look under the tagged photos and see who's tagging their photos under Boss Babe. I look through comment sections. So I pretty much look everywhere to find the guests because I kind of find people everywhere. But booking those first 100 guests, I would say in the beginning, my advice for booking people in the beginning, when you don't have an audience, when you don't really have a podcast, when you're just starting to launch, something that helped me is I would sell people more on my story and my background and what the podcast could be, because I didn't have a podcast yet. So found that in the beginning, when you sell people on the vision, because you don't really have anything yet, that worked. Because they're like, oh, like I really resonated with her story. Yeah, I'll go on her podcast. So that's what I did at the beginning, is I really sold people on the vision, sold people on me, sold people on what the podcast could be. And my advice for finding those people is I don't think it's really that hard to find podcast guests. I think a lot of people want the opportunity to share their story somewhere, and it never hurts to ask someone. Even if they don't say yes, that still gives you the opportunity to change your pitch to the person, to practice different pitches, to see if one works better than the other, and to kind of explore and see your boundaries of who's saying yes and who's saying no. And can I reach out to a higher level guest, or who do I need to reach out to? Or can I reach out to a friend of this person? Maybe the friend has a connection to this person, and just kind of build the community and build your guest list from there. But I think really at the beginning, it's not that hard to find people, because there's people everywhere looking to share their stories in all these different Facebook groups and all these different platforms. So I think it's just really having the courage at the beginning to reach out to them, and just to know, even if they say no, that's okay. And that doesn't necessarily mean no forever. They could potentially be a guest in your podcast a year, 2, 3 years down the line.
One of the things that I really liked that you said was that you would look for guests everywhere. And you named several different websites like Podmatch, Podbooker, and several others. So I'll instruct the person doing the post-production and editing of this episode to go back and listen to each of those, make sure to get good notes, and we will be having all of those links that you mentioned, all of those resources in a cute little area on the podcast show notes. And so if you're listening now, if you were like, man, she went so fast, don't worry. We've already linked each and every one of those up. It's in the show notes. Just scroll down and you'll be able to click on those hyperlinks for any of the websites that she just mentioned. Another thing that I really loved, Sophia, that you mentioned as you were teaching us how to get guests is that you just don't worry about what they say.
Yeah.
That you're not concerned. They might say no, that's okay. And I think that's one of the scariest things that hold me back and many other people back. And you too, sometimes. I'm sure it has been inhibiting, but being open to the rejection or the not now is super duper important. And the third takeaway that I got from you is that you were asking tons of guests prior to the launch of the podcast, before you had a big following, before all of these things happened. And you mentioned that you would sell them on the vision. You would let them know who you are, what you're trying to achieve. And it was something that they wanted to get behind. And I think that's a takeaway that all of us can have. So with all that said, you gave tons of good and useful tips. And I want to find out, in your experience, where you are right now, Sophia, what has been like the absolute biggest challenge of launching your podcast over the last year or so?
So I think the challenge was at the beginning. I think it was there. I don't think it's really a challenge now. I think it was just at the beginning of like, is this story going to resonate? Am I going to resonate? Are these guests going to resonate? And really, because I had no interview experience, I had no experience talking to people. I'm more of an introvert. I think that was the limiting belief at the beginning is, can an introvert do a podcast? I didn't know. So I think it was really the beginning and those limiting beliefs at the beginning that were holding me back.
That's interesting. I wouldn't have thought that you were an introvert. So I'm just curious, like, with that said, what inspired you to need to have a podcast? Because it's almost like if you are naturally introverted, then like you would never want to do something like that. You just wouldn't want to put yourself out there. So I'm curious, and I might be just projecting or making assumptions that are wrong, but in your experience, besides just a little bit of fear, what was your big why that got you to do it even though you were introverted?
Well, I kind of put that, well, the thing is, I looked at all the people I admired. So I looked at Lewis Howes, I looked at Ed Milet, I looked at all these people that I was admiring, and I was wondering, like, what's the part of them that I admire the most? Because I think those things that we're jealous of, the things that we admire, it kind of tells us something about ourselves. And I was like, oh, I really admire how they're able to go up on stage. I really admire how they're able to share their story. I really admire how they're building this personal brand for themselves, having these events, cultivating this community. I really admire all of that. I wish I could do that. So I kind of looked at those traits that I was admiring. I was like, okay, if you're admiring these traits, you need to start to build something. Need to start to build a community because that's something you secretly want to. So I was kind of looking at that and reflecting back on that. And I was reflecting back on my personal development journey. And one of the transformational things that was for me was tuning into Lewis's Howes podcast for the first time and just getting into his podcast. I've listened to probably every one of them. And just getting into that podcast, I was like, oh, podcasts can be really transformational for someone else's growth. And so I was like, oh, I want to be able to facilitate growth for someone else too. Why not start the podcast? So I was able to shelf the limiting belief at the beginning. And then over time, I started to hear these more and more incredible stories. And I said, how can I not do this? Like, how can I not share more of these stories? So at the beginning, I was just shelving it. And then in the middle, it was just getting to share those stories. I made it more about other people's stories than my own limiting beliefs around it.
What is 2 to 3 mistakes that you've made throughout your podcasting journey that you don't want a new podcaster to make?
I would say one of the mistakes at the beginning is saying yes to everyone, because, you start to have a podcast and then a lot of people start to reach out to you and they start to find you and you start saying yes to everyone because you have a hard time saying no. I noticed that was something for me, is that I had a hard time saying no to people, even though I knew it wasn't going to be a good fit, or I knew they were going to be constantly pitching themselves and that it wasn't going to be very valuable conversation. I knew that at the beginning. I had the intuition, I had the hit that it's not going to be a good fit, but I didn't listen to it anyways. So I think that was one of the major mistakes. Second major mistake is waiting until everything's perfect and until I was ready to start the podcast. Because I think really you're never going to be ready to start the podcast. You kind of have to start and learn and fail and just change from there. So I think waiting for that was definitely another big mistake. Third mistake is thinking that I needed to have a bunch of followers on Instagram. I needed to have a big following. I needed to have an audience, or else the podcast wasn't going to do well. I didn't think of really you could build the audience and build your podcast at the same time. I didn't really think about that. So I would say those are the 3 major ones.
Oh my gosh, these are good. These are so good. I love all of them. So the first one is something that I too have had a lot of challenges with. It's like I'm an opportunistic person. I also like to be nice, people pleasing, being recognized as somebody who's kind and generous, and saying no, it hurts. It's scary. It's like, I don't want to say no. I'll just say yes. And then maybe I won't post it. And then I actually do post it because for me, oftentimes, naturally, there's no backbone because I don't want to mess anything up. I want to tiptoe on the ice. I want to be careful. And I think that's such a bigger piece of advice than I would have ever been able to say when I was 20 years old, by the way. So I think that's awesome. Just being able to say no to people. So I want to find out how you do that. Like, someone comes up to you and they say, hey, I'd love to jump on your podcast. You're normal and you don't want them on because you don't know if it's going to be right, but you're scared to say no. So how do you do it?
Well, I think it's saying yes to those ones that should have been no. You say yes a couple times and then you kind of learn. So it's something you kind of have to run into the door and then figure it out. So I don't think I would have been able to figure it out unless I said yes at the beginning, even though I knew it was a no. So you do that enough times and you're like, okay, I need to really learn how to say no because this is not working out for me. So I needed that. It happened at least 3 or 4 times. And I was like, okay, there's a lesson here. There's something you need to take away from this. So it really had to happen about 3 or 4 times. And then I was like, okay, this is not happening again. We're not doing this again, Sophia. We need to correct this behavior and learn how to say no. So it's not easy, obviously. It's not easy to say no to people because you feel like they're going to take it offensively on you and they're going to get mad at you for saying no. So I feel like it's definitely not easy to learn how to say no. But the quicker you can learn to say no, the better. But I think that something that's helped me in saying no is I usually just tell them like, hey, I'm just sorry. I just don't think it's a good fit right now. Right now I have guests booked up to the end of the year. I'll reach out to you again if I think it could be a good fit later on. But right now I just don't see it as a good fit. I love what you're doing. I just don't think it's a good match for the show. So just being honest with them and just being transparent. And another thing, yeah, I would say that's the best advice is just being honest and transparent. And even though it's hard, it's a lot better than doing an interview that you know is not in alignment with you. And just sitting in through that interview, it's harder. It's a lot harder than having to say no. And, no is actually a lot easier when you compare it to that interview and compare it to being not in alignment and comparing it to having that discussion that you knew at the beginning was not one that was supposed to be had.
Very good. The second one that you mentioned was also really, really good takeaway. Waiting until you were ready. I thought that was interesting because there's such a big difference. There's I'm just going to start and I'm not going to overthink it. And it could be crappy podcast with sound quality that's below what you want it to be. It could be that you don't have the best guests. You have the wrong guest if you move too fast. It could be that you title it wrong. There's a lot that could happen, like if you go too fast, but at the same time, if you go too slow, you might never, ever do it. So I think that's really interesting. Is there a balance point for you, Sophia? Because I generally preach to my listener, ready, aim, fire. I generally am telling them, don't go ready, fire, aim like everybody else is telling you. And so I'm just curious, what do you think the balance is of what you need to think about, what you need to have done, where you can change it later that's appropriate in your mind, Sophia?
I realize I tend to attract a lot of perfectionists, and maybe that's because I'm a perfectionist, but I realize the people I tend to attract, they have like this super high, unrealistic standard for themselves at the beginning. So that's why I say start before you're ready, because they usually have this standard for themselves of like a podcaster who's been doing it 5-6 years. And it's not a realistic standard for themselves. So that's why I say start before you're ready, because I notice I tend to attract those people who put like this high bar for themselves that's just not realistic at the beginning. And I think those people kind of need the permission that it's okay to not have it all together and it's okay to kind of test and try and refine. And you're not going to know how to interview someone at the beginning, but you could do different interviews. You could start interviewing your family members. You could start getting practice. You could start learning, but I think it's just unrealistic because I find a lot of people tend to compare themselves to someone who's been in the industry years and years. And I just don't think that's a fair comparison for them to do.
So good. Your third one, which was, I think of it more of like the chicken and the egg, which comes first? Do you have your audience or do you have your podcast first? And it seems like something that many people have gone through as well. So I'm really glad that you brought it up. Multiple people come up to me and they'll say, Adam, I really want to start my podcast. I want your help starting a podcast. But you should know, I don't have a big Instagram following. I'm not even on TikTok. I'm not active on social media. So this will never work, they'll say. And I just think personally, just like you did, it's so important to have a brand. And the only way to get a brand is to do something. And so if you are listening and you're saying, I shouldn't have a podcast yet because I don't have a following, well, can I slap you right in the cheek and have you switch the way that you think and say, oh, I need a following like Ed Millett and like Gary Vee and like Sophia Lorena. I need a following. So I'm going to start a podcast. And remember that the podcast is one of the major tools that helps you to be able to gain that audience that you want in the first place. My Instagram, for example, I think I had 120 or 150 followers before I started my podcast. And now there's like 7,000 followers on my podcast. I used to get 1 or 2 likes on a post. And now I think I'm getting like 500 to 1,000 likes on a post, on each post. So that is what I really hope that you take that away. If you were like wondering, should I even have a podcast? Because I don't have an audience yet. Just imagine a big, swift slap in the face and open up your eyes and say, all right, that's how I'm going to build that audience that I need. So love it, love it, love it. What is the final piece of advice, Sophia, that you want to give to the listener? And before you mention it, I will let the listener know again, and we don't cuss on all of our podcast episodes, but when we do it right. When we do, we mark explicit because we don't want the whole podcast to be taken down. So this podcast title has a cuss word in there. She did it on purpose in order to get you to be surprised and to open up and say, what's going on here? I got to try that. So shit show of my 20s. No, I'm saying it wrong. You got to fix it.
The shit show of my 20s.
Okay. I missed it. So that's already in the show notes. So if you're listening, just scroll right down and you'll be able to check that out. I hope that if and when you do, if you listen to like 1 or 2 episodes and you have a good feel for what you think of the podcast, I would ask you to give an honest written rating and review for Sophia. She reads each and every one of these, and that way you can know what else you want her to talk about and who else you want her to have on the show. So spend just a couple of minutes, and it really only takes that long, to leave her a rating and a review. And feel free to let her know, hey, I heard about you on Adam's podcast. Go ahead and say that in the review too. And if you haven't reviewed this show, go ahead and do it. Sophia, we're wrapping up, and I want you to share what you want the listener to know before we go.
Yeah. So something that I wish I would have focused on earlier is LinkedIn. So I just started really focusing on it the last 30 days. So the last 30 days, I decided, okay, I'm going to share stories that I've never shared before. I'm going to change the way that I'm storytelling on this platform, because the way that I was storytelling before wasn't getting any traction. So I was like, I need to change this because this way obviously isn't working. I'm going to start with the first sentence that's pretty bold, captures people's attention and draws them in. Because you really only have that first sentence on LinkedIn to capture someone's attention. So I decided, okay, I'm going to start doing this. And I'm going to start using this to help me grow the podcast. And what I really love about LinkedIn is that when your connections like it, it shows it to their connections. When their connections like it, it shows it to their connections. Another thing is when you comment on someone's post, it's kind of like a mini post, because all of your audience sees so-and-so commented on this post, and then they see your comment. So it's another way for brand recognition, because they're constantly seeing you comment on other people's posts. So they're like, oh, this girl's everywhere. She's all over LinkedIn. She's all over Instagram. And so I've been noticing that by doing those stories, doing those relatable stories, either about rejection, about starting over, about when you didn't get the job, about learning something new, about limiting beliefs, doing all those different stories that have some key element that lets them see themselves in your stories, those stories do so well. I've had a post that got 16,000 views, and I only was getting a couple hundred before, but it was all between the last month. Now an average post of mine on LinkedIn is getting about 8,000 views. And I'm posting a couple times a week, but it's just crazy when you change the way you storytell, when you change the way you craft your post on LinkedIn. There's so much opportunity for growth on there. And I see people who don't even have a huge audience on LinkedIn, but they get a ton of traction on their posts because they're really good at storytelling. They're really good at engaging. And so I don't think you necessarily have to have a lot of followers on LinkedIn either, because the organic reach is really good. So that's my advice, is I would have started posting differently sooner. And I would have started doing different things on LinkedIn sooner, But that's my advice, is to really focus on LinkedIn because there's so much open space there and there's not a lot of people posting.
I definitely just learned something really, really cool from you. You are so intentional now about your LinkedIn. You know exactly what you're going to post, why you're going to post, and you've spent some time with two things that you mentioned. One of them is to be intentional about commenting on other people's posts. And I learned so much just thinking, I never knew that when you're commenting on somebody else's post, it's almost as if you're doing your own mini post and they can kind of find you. And so spending time going in and commenting on other people's posts and saying, like, giving advice, giving kudos, giving your opinions of something. And that seems to be a way that I've never tried on LinkedIn. I've done it on Facebook. I think it's actually worked. I haven't done it intentionally, but I've done a lot of comments on Facebook and I think it works. On LinkedIn, I'm going to start doing that. So thank you. And the second piece about you being intentional about LinkedIn is you've started crafting your posts a little bit different. So part one is like the big hook. And I don't remember exactly how you said that, but I'm going to call it just a hook. It's something catchy. It's something outlandish. It's something surprising. It's something polarizing, drawing your line in the sand. It's something that strikes curiosity in the person reading it. And it's taken your post from, I think, 200 people-ish to see it to 8 to 16,000 people-ish to see it. And after the hook, you mentioned that it goes into a story. And I liked the qualifying word that you used there, relatable story. Just having a story certainly isn't going to work. It needs to capture the attention and pull in and attract your perfect avatar, your perfect listener, to want to read that entire post. And it sounds like you're being incredibly intentional about which stories that you're sharing. And I heard you say that you're being basically a little bit more vulnerable with your stories, opening up, sharing stories that you had never shared before. And even that could be a good hook. I've never told this to a soul. Wait, what? Keep going. I'm on the edge of my seat. So those types of stories seem like they're really going to work really well for you. And I cannot wait for that to really grow that podcast for you as well. So I want to just thank you for all of your time, being vulnerable, sharing tips, saying no, not waiting until you're ready, not waiting until you have a big audience on Instagram or TikTok. Just go ahead and get it started. If just kind of getting over some of those limiting beliefs. I know you're 20 when you did this, and talking about crafting a post, talking about being intentional on LinkedIn. I think there's a ton of takeaways for each and every one of us. So I'm going to say thank you. And to the listener, go out, start your podcast. If you need any help, I'm here. Just go to growyourshow.com, schedule a call with me, and I'd be happy to sit down and just pour into your business. All right, Sophia Lorena, all of your links are in the show notes. And so we don't even have to worry about that. If you're listening, scroll down and you can connect with Sophia and get those other resources that she mentioned on the podcast today. All right, bye for now. This episode is brought to you by growyourshow.com. Grow Your Show lets you be the star of your show while we handle all the hard stuff. We offer reliable and affordable post-production services that allow you to grow your show organically without all the work. So go ahead and check out the website right now and feel free to schedule a call with me and let's take your show to the next level. Again, growyourshow.com. You just press record. We handle the rest.